Okay, so I want to talk about a very important set of nuclei. Remember, nuclei are clumps of gray matter in the central nervous system, right? These are subcortical. They're deep inside the brain. And to get to them, we're going to have to take this model apart a little bit to show you. But a clump of critical nuclei known as the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, many people learn, is important for something called homeostasis, right? Which means stable state. And what that implies is the hypothalamus actually monitors aspects of the internal environment of you. Because, to be honest, you're really a piece of the ancient ocean, sort of ambulatory, walking around, moving around, and there's an environment here that has to be maintained within certain limits. And stable state, homeostasis, refers to the fact that, certain aspects of our internal milieu, internal environment, have to be maintained within very, very strict limits, like, for example, the pH of the blood, right? Certain aspects of our body temperature. However, other aspects of the internal milieu do change, right? And they can change, in response to experience. Like if there's a threat, right? For example, you can have an autonomic response where you have a fight or flight, an intense, kind of response. And so your heart rate goes up dramatically and, from sort of its baseline. So homeostasis, it's often sometimes referred to as now allostasis, which means sort of a variable state. But the hypothalamus plays a role in helping to sort of modulate, the aspects of the internal environment based upon, what the requirements are at any one time. So to that end, it has afferents. It has sensory information coming in, about, for example, what's traveling in the blood, how many ions do you have, how many salts compared to, how much water you've got, what is the temperature of the body, for example, what sort of stressors are you experiencing at any one time. So it has these inputs that are coming into the hypothalamus, and some of these are coming, from sensory afferents. Some of these we're going to see their inputs coming from the frontal lobe, from areas of the cortex where you're imagining potential stressors and things like that. But then it also has outputs, so it can influence the internal milieu. It can change aspects of your environment. So the outputs for the hypothalamus, let me show you where it is. So here's the brain. Remember, here's our frontal lobe, and there's a blood vessel here called the basilar artery that's kind of in the way. So if I pull this down a little bit, you might be able to see right in there is a very important gland, because this is going to be one of the ways that the hypothalamus can actually influence the internal environment of your body is by provoking the release of hormones, which are chemicals that are going to be released into the systemic circulation, the blood, your overall body's bloodstream. So it can go and act at receptors on cells, these chemicals, these that are called hormones, all throughout the body, and make, sort of large-scale changes in the activity of the body, at one time. And that pituitary gland, that's the gland that the hypothalamus influences and provokes the release of hormones from, is linked by a small stalk. It's called the infundibular stalk to the hypothalamus, which is back in there. So I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna take apart the temporal lobe. Right, I'm gonna remove the temporal lobe and the cerebellum. Temporal lobe and cerebellum over here, and now you've got the frontal lobe still there, but now you can see better. That right there is going to be the pituitary gland, and then deeper inside there is going to be what we call the hypothalamus. These are all these different nuclei that are receiving information about the internal state of the body, and then one of the ways they can communicate with the body and make changes to get you back into balance is through provoking the release of hormones from the pituitary gland into the bloodstream as a whole. Now, another way that the hypothalamus can actually influence, our, responses and make changes is through direct output, neural output to the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So the hypothalamus can sort of directly stimulate autonomic changes, and so you can increase heart rate, reduce heart rate, increase blood pressure, reduce blood pressure, make changes, autonomic changes through, ultimately the release of, in the body, right, in the peripheral nervous system, of norepinephrine for sympathetic fight or flight activation, and acetylcholine, right, for parasympathetic kind of, energy conservation sorts of responses. And then the third way that the hypothalamus really impacts your internal environment is actually by communicating with the frontal lobe, with your cortex, for a more felt experience of the state of the body. Like if you're too hot, not only will you, for example, start sweating perhaps, but you'll also feel hot. So that information has to work its way from the hypothalamus up to the cortex, the frontal lobe. It actually arrives in an area of the frontal lobe that's kind of medial, that's in the middle here. Let me see if I can get this apart here. This is not so easy. Here we go. All right. You see here? And it's going to arrive in an area that's going to be really important for, decision making and drugs. So here is this is right down the middle. This is the frontal lobe here, and we've taken it apart. And you can see here's this very important band of interconnecting white matter that connects the right and left hemispheres. It's called the corpus callosum. And then down here, this little triangle stuff here, this is going to be the hypothalamus. It's going to project, and we'll see that this structure right above the hypothalamus, right above the brainstem, which is called the thalamus, is really important for initially processing sensory information, from your eyes, your ears, etc., before sending it on to specific areas of cortex, and also receiving lots of feedback from areas of cortex. But this hypothalamically, kind of processed afferent or sensory information, which is on its way to the frontal lobe, the medial frontal lobe, also is ascending, it's coming up to the cortex, so it's going to make a stop in a nucleus in the thalamus as well, and then project into this gyrus that's medial, that surrounds the corpus callosum. This is called the cingulate gyrus. The cingulate gyrus is the gyrus that goes all the way around the corpus callosum. And right here in the anterior portion, this is called the anterior cingulate. And the anterior cingulate receives a lot of this hypothalamic information. And then it turns out this anterior cingulate is a really important component of multiple distributed networks in the brain, including those that allow you to sort of ruminate and reflect and think back, on past experience and make plans for the future. So a lot of these ruminative networks, a specific network called the default network, for example, and also it's a component of networks that are more, on the side of the brain, but it's a sort of medial component that allow you to attend to stuff, externally, to be sort of externally task focused. So, a lot of our decision making about where we put our energies, right? Do we ruminate and go over stuff, or are we driven by things that are external? Involves how we feel to some extent. And this anterior cingulate, we're going to see, is an important node in many distributed networks, and it's receiving a lot of information about your body, about the current state of your body. So we often talk about the hypothalamus as being a drive generator. If you're hungry, for example, if you don't have enough circulating glucose, you're going to feel hungry, and it's this. You're not going to feel hungry. Your behavior is going to be driven by food-related items in your environment. You're going to start thinking and dwelling on, how do I get some food? If you are thirsty, right? You have, for example, too many salts circulating in your bloodstream and not enough water. Well, it turns out there's really remarkable mechanisms in the hypothalamus. Like there are cells, if there's too much salt in the blood, these cells, the water will actually diffuse out, right? Because it's concentration gradient driven, and the cells will shrink, and they'll open channels that let sodium come in, and they'll depolarize, and they'll start firing. And it'll result in the release of hormones, for example, from the pituitary that'll help you retain water, in the kidneys. But it'll also communicate again via the thalamus into the anterior cingulate. So you feel thirsty, and you start dwelling on thirst, and you start, thinking of how to get water, and you start looking around things in your environment that are water related or drink related, really increase in salience. So the hypothalamus is a really important sort of drive generator for like hunger, thirst, sex, all sorts of things. It's really important for what we call, the stress response too. Like if there are significant stressful circumstances, there are hormones that are released that will, travel through the blood, that'll influence the release of other hormones from the adrenal glands. It can provoke a powerful sort of stress response, which then those hormones can come back into the brain and then bind to receptors and alter how, these networks that allow us to perceive and, make decisions, etc., can respond. So the hypothalamus is a very important drive generator, for basic drives.